On the afternoon of June 28, 1995, 17 campesinos lay dead on a dusty mountain road in Guerrero, Mexico. All farmers, all members of the same peasant organization, demanding land rights and fair prices for their crops. The method, execution-style shootings carried out by state police during what was supposed to be a routine checkpoint stop. The perpetrators, members of the Guerrero State Motorized Police, acting under orders that remain disputed to this day. The Mexican government would later try to classify it as a confrontation between armed aggressors and law enforcement. But the forensic evidence told a different story. It told of farmers shot while kneeling, execution style, at point-blank range. It told of a massacre disguised as self-defense, and 17 families who learned that demanding your rights in rural Mexico could cost you everything, including your life. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that expose the brutal relationship between the Mexican state and indigenous communities and revealed how easily governments transform political dissent into grounds for execution. Guerrero State stretches along Mexico's Pacific coast, one of the country's poorest and most violent regions. In 1995, the state covered roughly 64,000 square kilometers, home to approximately 3 million people, many of them indigenous Mixtec, Tlapanec, and Nahua communities living in mountain villages accessible only by dirt roads that became impassable during rainy season. The geography was extreme, coastal plains giving way to the Sierra Madre del Sur, mountains rising to over 3,000 meters, covered in pine forests, and coffee plantations worked by families who'd farmed the same land for generations. The town of Coyuca de Benitez sat about 30 kilometers northwest of Acapulco, population around 60,000, split between the tourist economy of nearby beaches and the agricultural economy of surrounding mountains. This was where two Mexicos collided, the resort Mexico of international tourism and foreign investment, and the rural Mexico of subsistence farming, dirt floors, and communities where electricity and running water were luxuries, not givens. June 1995 was rainy season in Guerrero. The temperature in the mountains hovered around 25 degrees Celsius during the day, dropping to 15 at night. The air smelled like wet earth and coffee blossoms and wood smoke from cooking fires. The roads, mostly unpaved, carved into mountainsides decades ago, turned to mud that could trap vehicles for hours. Traveling anywhere meant calculating timing, knowing which roads were passable, which bridges had washed out, which communities were cut off until the rain stopped. But June 1995 wasn't just another rainy season in rural Guerrero. The state was in political crisis. The previous year, the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas had shocked Mexico and exposed the depth of indigenous anger at government policies that favored urban development and foreign investment while leaving rural communities in desperate poverty. The uprising had spread, not as armed rebellion but as inspiration. Across Mexico, peasant organizations were becoming more militant, more willing to confront authorities, more demanding about land rights, agricultural subsidies, and political representation. In Guerrero specifically, the governor was Rubén Figueroa Alcocer, representing the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, that had controlled Mexico for 66 consecutive years through a combination of political machinery, corruption, and, when necessary, violence. Figueroa had taken office in April 1993 with promises of development and security. What he delivered was increasing militarization of rural areas, violent suppression of dissent, and policies that benefited large landowners and foreign investors while pushing small farmers deeper into poverty. The tension between the government and rural communities had been building for years. But in early 1995, it reached a breaking point. The Organización Campesina de la Sierra del Sur, the peasant organization of the Southern Sierra, was founded in 1994 by indigenous farmers and laborers in Guerrero's mountain regions. The OCSS wasn't a guerrilla movement, wasn't armed revolutionaries. It was a coalition of coffee growers, corn farmers, day laborers, and their families who'd organized to demand basic things: fair prices for their crops, land titles for territory they'd farmed for generations, infrastructure improvements like roads and schools, access to credit and agricultural training. The organization had grown rapidly, from maybe 200 members in early 1994 to over 2,000 by mid-1995. This growth terrified authorities because organized farmers were harder to control than isolated communities. An organized movement could coordinate action, could demand concessions, could make political trouble for a government that preferred rural poverty to remain invisible and voiceless. The leader of OCSS was a man named Gilberto Romero Vázquez, 43 years old in June 1995. He'd grown up in a village called Coyuca de Catalán, had worked as a coffee picker, a corn farmer, a construction laborer, whatever paid enough to feed his wife and 5 children. Gilberto was literate, unusual for his generation and region, had taught himself to read using old newspapers and government documents. He understood that farming wasn't just about working hard, it was about navigating systems designed to extract labor and resources from rural communities while providing minimal support in return. Gilberto stood about 5'7", stocky from decades of physical labor, with hands scarred from machete work and sun-damaged skin that made him look older than his years. His most distinctive feature was his voice, loud, commanding, the kind of voice that could address a crowd in a town plaza and be heard 3 blocks away. He spoke a mixture of Spanish and Mixtec, could switch between languages depending on audience, was equally comfortable talking to illiterate farmers and educated activists from Mexico City. What Gilberto valued most was dignity. Not money, he had none. Not political power, he held no office. Dignity. The sense that campesinos deserved to be treated as citizens rather than as expendable labor. That indigenous communities had rights, even if those rights were rarely respected. That the Mexican Constitution's promises about land reform and indigenous autonomy weren't just words, but obligations the government needed to fulfill. By June 1995, Gilberto had become a problem for Guerrero's government. He organized protests, led marches to government offices, filed petitions demanding land titles and agricultural subsidies. He spoke to journalists, gave interviews to human rights organizations, made noise in ways that embarrassed authorities who preferred rural communities to suffer quietly. Governor Figueroa had labeled OCSS a destabilizing force, had suggested in speeches that peasant organizations were fronts for guerrilla movements, had created an atmosphere where demanding your rights became synonymous with threatening state security. The other key figure in OCSS was a younger man named Severiano Santana Pineda, 29 years old, who'd been radicalized by his education. Severiano had attended Teachers College in Chilpancingo, Guerrero's capital, on scholarship. He'd been exposed to liberation theology, to histories of peasant movements across Latin America, to ideas about social justice and indigenous rights. He'd returned to his home village convinced that change was possible if communities organized and demanded their rights collectively. Severiano was tall, about 5'11", thin from a metabolism that never slowed down and from the constant stress of organizing work. He wore wire-frame glasses that he'd bought at a pharmacy in Acapulco, prescription wrong, but close enough. His hands were soft compared to other campesinos because he'd spent more time reading and writing than farming, which earned him suspicion from some and respect from others. He kept notebooks filled with detailed records of OCSS membership, meeting notes, demands submitted to government, responses received, or more often, not received. What Severiano valued most was education. He believed absolutely that education was the path out of poverty, that if rural communities could educate their children, the next generation wouldn't have to live the same cycles of exploitation and powerlessness. He organized literacy classes in mountain villages, taught farmers how to read government documents and agricultural contracts, how to calculate fair prices for their crops, how to understand their legal rights under Mexican law, even if those rights were rarely enforced. Together, Gilberto and Severiano represented OCSS's dual approach, Gilberto providing the charisma and organizational experience, Severiano providing the intellectual framework and documentation. They complemented each other, trusted each other completely, and by June 1995 had built an organization that terrified authorities precisely because it was peaceful, legal, and effective at mobilizing communities that had previously been atomized and powerless. The year leading up to June 1995 had been increasingly violent in Guerrero. In December 1994, a group called the Popular Revolutionary Army, EPR, had emerged, claiming to be a Marxist guerrilla organization fighting for indigenous rights and social justice. The EPR was small, probably fewer than 200 armed members, but its existence gave the government justification for militarizing rural Guerrero. Army checkpoints appeared on mountain roads. Police conducted raids on villages suspected of supporting guerrillas. Anyone organizing peasants became suspect, potentially connected to armed insurgency, even when there was no evidence of such connections. Governor Figueroa used the EPR threat to justify increasingly aggressive policies. He increased the state motorized police force, gave them expanded authority to stop and search vehicles, authorized them to break up protests and detain organizers. The motorized police, officially called Policía Motorizada del Estado, were not regular police. They were a paramilitary force better armed than municipal police, less accountable than federal forces, operating in gray zones where the line between law enforcement and state-sponsored violence became very thin. The commander of the motorized police was a man named Brigadier General Carlos Sáenz Mata, 52 years old, career military who'd transferred to police work in 1992. Sáenz was old-school authoritarian, believed that order required force, that dissent was dangerous, that rural communities needed to be controlled rather than engaged. He'd served during Mexico's dirty war of the 1970s and 80s, when the government had disappeared thousands of suspected leftist activists. He brought that mentality to his role commanding Guerrero's state police. Threats needed to be eliminated, not negotiated with. Under Sáenz's command, the motorized police developed a reputation for brutality. Multiple reports from human rights organizations documented arbitrary detentions, torture of suspects, extrajudicial killings disguised as confrontations with criminals. But the complaints went nowhere because the government investigated itself and found itself innocent. The few cases that reached courts were dismissed for lack of evidence or witness intimidation. By June 1995, the relationship between OCSS and the government had deteriorated completely. Gilberto and Severiano had led protests in front of the governor's palace in Chilpancingo. They'd occupied government offices demanding meetings with officials who refused to meet with them. They'd organized a march of over 1,000 campesinos to Acapulco, disrupting tourist traffic for 3 hours, generating national media attention that embarrassed Figueroa. The government's response was to label OCSS as EPR supporters. No evidence, just accusations. The logic was simple. If peasant organizations could be linked to armed insurgency, the government could justify repression. And in the climate of 1995 Mexico, with the Zapatista uprising still fresh in everyone's mind, accusations of guerrilla connections were enough to legitimize violence. On June 15, 1995, Governor Figueroa gave a speech in Acapulco where he said, "Criminal elements disguised as campesino leaders are destabilizing Guerrero. These groups claim to represent farmers, but actually serve foreign interests seeking to undermine Mexican sovereignty. We will not tolerate this destabilization. We will respond with all necessary force to maintain order and protect the public interest." The speech was broadcast statewide. Human rights observers noted that all necessary force was coded language, historical precedent suggesting it meant the government was preparing to act violently. They warned that OCSS leaders were in danger. They recommended international observers be present at any future OCSS activities to prevent human rights violations. The warnings were ignored. On the morning of June 28, 1995, approximately 60 members of OCSS gathered in the village of El Ticuí, high in the mountains, about 80 kilometers from Chilpancingo. They'd come from various communities, some walking for hours on mountain trails, others arriving in old pickup trucks that struggled on dirt roads turned muddy from recent rain. The meeting had been planned for weeks, a strategy session to discuss their demands, plan future actions, and coordinate with other peasant organizations in neighboring states. The meeting started at 8 a.m. and lasted until about 1 p.m. They discussed crop prices. Coffee had crashed. Corn prices were barely covering costs. They discussed land disputes. Several communities were fighting with large landowners who claimed territory the campesinos had farmed for generations. They discussed the government's refusal to provide agricultural credit or infrastructure improvements, and they discussed security. Rumors had been circulating that the government was planning to arrest OCSS leaders, that police were looking for excuses to break up the organization. Gilberto addressed the group around noon. He stood in the center of a dirt courtyard, 60 farmers sitting on benches or squatting in the shade, listening. His voice carried the weight of someone who knew they were operating in dangerous territory, but believed the cause justified the risk. "We are not criminals," Gilberto said in a mixture of Spanish and Mixtec. "We are farmers. We work the land. We feed our families. We ask only for what the Constitution promises: fair treatment, land rights, support for agriculture. The government calls us destabilizers. They call us guerrillas. But we are neither. We are citizens demanding our rights." He paused, looked around at faces he'd known for years, men and women who'd trusted him, who'd joined OCSS believing organization was safer than isolation. "They want us to be afraid," Gilberto continued. "They want us to stay quiet, to accept poverty as our fate. But we will not be quiet. We will continue organizing. We will continue demanding justice. And if they try to stop us, if they try to silence us, we will make so much noise that all of Mexico hears us." The group voted on their next action, a march to Atoyac de Alvarez, a larger town about 40 kilometers away, where they'd present demands to the municipal president and local police commander. The march was scheduled for July 5th. They discussed logistics: who would bring supplies, who would organize transportation, who would contact media to document the march. Everything planned carefully, peacefully, legally. Around 1:30 p.m., the meeting ended. The campesinos began preparing to return to their home villages. Some would walk, others would crowd into the beds of pickup trucks for the rough journey down mountain roads. One group of about 25 men decided to travel together in two vehicles, a 1984 Nissan pickup truck and a 1978 Chevrolet Suburban, both loaded beyond capacity because buying two vehicles meant buying gasoline for two vehicles, and nobody had money for that. Gilberto and Severiano were in this group. So was a 19-year-old named Elpidio Zamora Cruz, who'd joined OCSS 3 months earlier after his father had been cheated by a coffee buyer. So was a man named Aurelio Torres Tapia, 52, who'd farmed the same piece of land for 40 years and was fighting eviction by a company that claimed his land was needed for a resort development. So was a teenager named Fidel Valencia Pinacho, 17, who attended the meeting with his father and who'd been talking about going to teachers' college like Severiano. At 2:15 p.m., the two vehicles left El Tiqui, heading down the mountain road toward the highway that would take them toward their various home villages. The road was narrow, carved into the mountainside with steep drops on one side and rock face on the other. The surface was mud and loose gravel, dangerous even in dry season, potentially deadly during rains. But this was the only road. You took it, or you didn't travel. The journey should have taken about 90 minutes to reach the main highway. From there, the group would split up, heading to different villages, a routine trip that hundreds of campesinos made weekly, traveling to meetings or markets or family visits. Nothing unusual except the cargo, 25 farmers who'd just spent 5 hours discussing how to organize against a government that increasingly viewed organization as rebellion. At 3:47 p.m., the two vehicles approached a bend in the road near a place called Aguas Blancas, white waters, named for a stream that ran white with rapids during rainy season. The location was approximately 15 kilometers from where they started, maybe halfway to the main highway, a spot where the road widened slightly, creating a natural place for vehicles to pass each other or for travelers to rest. Waiting at Aguas Blancas was a checkpoint, 8 vehicles from the Guerrero State Motorized Police. Approximately 40 officers in tactical gear, armed with automatic rifles, positioned on both sides of the road in a formation that blocked passage completely. The checkpoint had been established sometime that afternoon, exact time unclear, by order of Commander Sanz Mata, who'd received intelligence, never specified, never documented, that a group connected to EPR guerrillas would be traveling this road. The two vehicles carrying OCSS members slowed, stopped about 20 meters from the police blockade. Gilberto was driving the Nissan pickup. He could see the police, could see their weapons, could see that this wasn't a routine checkpoint, but something else, something dangerous. "This is wrong," Severiano said from the passenger seat. "There's too many of them. They're positioned like they're expecting trouble." Gilberto nodded slowly. "We turn around. They'll chase us. We go forward. We give them excuse to search us, maybe arrest us." "We're legal," Severiano said. "We're citizens traveling home from a meeting. We have rights." Gilberto looked at his friend, at this educated young man who still believed Mexican law protected people like them. "Rights are for people in cities. Out here, rights are whatever they say they are." But there was no choice. Behind them, the road was blocked by their own vehicle and the Suburban. Ahead, 40 armed police. They had to go forward. At 3:51 p.m., Gilberto drove slowly toward the checkpoint. The Suburban followed. When they were about 10 meters away, a police officer, later identified as Lieutenant Hermenegildo Solano Rivera, raised his hand, signaling them to stop. Both vehicles stopped. Gilberto climbed out of the pickup truck, hands visible, moving slowly, non-threatening. Severiano got out from the passenger side. Behind them, Campesinos began climbing out of the truck beds, confused, nervous, but assuming this was routine harassment. Police stopped indigenous people all the time, searched them, confiscated money or tools, roughed them up, then let them go. Annoying but survivable. Lieutenant Solano approached Gilberto. The lieutenant was about 35, stocky, with the face of someone who'd learned to enjoy authority. He carried a FX-05 Shootout assault rifle, Mexican-made, modern, the kind of weapon you didn't issue to police doing routine traffic stops. "Where are you coming from?" Solano asked in Spanish. "A meeting in El Ticuy," Gilberto replied. "We're farmers, heading home." "Farmers," Solano repeated like it was a joke. "You're OCSS." It wasn't a question. Gilberto understood immediately that this checkpoint wasn't random. They'd been waiting specifically for this group. "We're members of a legal organization," Gilberto said carefully. "We have rights to organize, to meet, to travel." "You have rights," Solano said, smiling. "Of course you do. Now get back in your vehicles and wait while we search them." The search began at 3:56 p.m. Police officers swarmed both vehicles, pulling out bags, tools, personal belongings. They were looking for weapons, for evidence connecting OCSS to EPR guerrillas. They found nothing, just farming tools, machetes, hoes, sacks of seed corn, personal items, clothing, food for the journey, a few books and notebooks in Severiano's bag. One officer found Severiano's notebooks, flipped through them, showed them to Solano. The notebooks contained membership lists, meeting notes, copies of petitions submitted to government. Perfectly legal. But Solano looked at them like he'd found evidence of conspiracy. "You're documenting everything," Solano said to Severiano, "making lists, planning actions. This is guerrilla organization." "This is legal civic organizing," Severiano replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have constitutional rights." Solano hit him across the face with the butt of his rifle. Severiano fell, blood pouring from his nose. Gilberto moved to help him, but two officers grabbed Gilberto, forced him to his knees. "Gilberto Romero Vasquez," Solano said, standing over him. "The famous campesino leader, the man who thinks he can challenge the government, the man who doesn't understand that order requires respect for authority." "We're peaceful," Gilberto said. Blood dripped from Severiano's nose onto the dirt road. Around them, the other campesinos stood frozen, understanding too late that this checkpoint was something different, something final. What happened next happened fast. Maybe 90 seconds total, though witnesses would disagree on timing, on sequence, on who fired first. Memory doesn't work well during massacres. The brain records fragments, pieces, images without context or order. At 4:03 p.m., Lieutenant Solano gave an order, not shouted, spoken normally like he was discussing weather. "Line them up." The police moved with practiced efficiency, like they'd done this before. They forced the campesinos into a line facing the rock wall on one side of the road. 25 men, not allowed to run, not allowed to resist, just herded into position like animals awaiting slaughter. Gilberto knew. In that moment, he knew completely what was about to happen. This wasn't arrest, wasn't detention. This was execution disguised as law enforcement, and there was nothing he could do except face it with whatever dignity remained. "We are citizens," Gilberto shouted, his voice carrying over the sounds of police shouting orders. "We have rights. We have families. We are not criminals." Solano walked along the line of kneeling men, rifle in hand. He stopped in front of Gilberto. "You had rights. Past tense. You should have stayed quiet. Should have accepted your place. Now you're terrorists, guerrillas, threats to state security, and threats must be eliminated." The shooting started at 4:04 p.m., The motorized police opened fire with automatic weapons from a distance of approximately 3 to 5 meters. The sound was apocalyptic, drowning out screams, drowning out prayers, drowning out everything except the mechanical thunder of dozens of rifles firing simultaneously at human bodies that had nowhere to run. Gilberto Romero Vasquez was shot 6 times, twice in the chest, once in the abdomen, 3 times in the back as he fell. Death was not instant but came quickly, within 15 seconds, as his lungs filled with blood and his heart struggled to pump through damaged vessels. Severiano Santana Pineda, still on the ground from being struck earlier, was shot 4 times in the back as he tried to crawl away. The bullets severed his spine, punctured both lungs, and caused massive internal bleeding. He died face down in the mud, his wire-frame glasses broken beside him, one hand still reaching toward his notebooks that lay scattered on the road. Elpidio Zamora Cruz, 19 years old, was shot 7 times, a pattern suggesting multiple officers targeted him. The first bullet entered through his right shoulder, spinning him around. The next 6 hit him as he fell, including 2 to the head that killed him before his body hit the ground. Aurelio Torres Tapia, 52, the farmer fighting eviction, was shot 3 times in the chest. He died clutching a small bag containing photographs of his children and grandchildren, pictures he'd been showing to other campesinos during the meeting earlier, proud of his family even as he fought to keep his land. Fidel Valencia Pinacho, 17 years old, who talked about Teachers College, was shot 5 times. Witnesses later reported he'd been crying, had been begging police not to shoot, had been saying, "I'm just a student, I'm not a guerrilla, please don't kill me." He was shot anyway, methodically, by officers who'd been trained that mercy was weakness and that orders superseded conscience. The massacre lasted approximately 90 seconds. When the shooting stopped, 17 bodies lay on the road at Aguas Blancas. Some had died instantly. Others were dying, bleeding out, drowning in their own blood, experiencing the final minutes of life as a confusion of pain and disbelief, and the understanding that they'd been murdered by their own government for demanding their rights. 8 campesinos survived. Some had hidden under the vehicles when shooting started. Others had been at the back of the line and had run into the forest when the first shots were fired, bullets chasing them, hitting trees, miraculously missing human targets. They survived because of luck, because police focused fire on the men at the front of the line, because in 90 seconds of chaos, some people get lucky while others die for reasons that have nothing to do with justice or guilt or anything except geography and timing. At 4:06 p.m., Lieutenant Solano walked among the bodies, checking for survivors. He found 3 men, still breathing, wounded but alive, conscious enough to understand what was happening. Solano shot each of them once in the head, execution style, making sure. These weren't combat casualties. These were executions, methodical and complete. The police then staged the scene. They placed guns and weapons near some of the bodies, weapons the campesinos had never possessed, weapons planted to create the narrative of a confrontation rather than a massacre. They photographed the scene, documenting the evidence they'd created. They radioed their commanders to report a confrontation with armed guerrillas affiliated with EPR. 17 hostiles killed, no police casualties, area secured. The 8 survivors who'd escaped into the forest made their way to the nearest village, a terrifying journey of several hours, running through mountain forest, expecting to be hunted, expecting bullets to find them, expecting death to catch up with them. They reached a village called Kilometro 42 around 8 p.m., told their story to villagers who at first didn't believe them because the scale of violence seemed impossible. 17 dead in a single incident, massacred by police, but the survivors were there, covered in mud and blood, traumatized, shaking, telling consistent stories about what they'd witnessed. The villagers contacted human rights organizations. By midnight, the news was spreading beyond Guerrero. By morning, it would be national and then international news. Governor Figueroa's initial response to news of the massacre was denial. On the evening of June 28th, his office issued a statement. State police engaged armed guerrillas near Aguas, Blancas. After a confrontation, 17 aggressors were killed. Weapons and subversive materials were recovered from the scene. Police acted appropriately to defend themselves and maintain public order. The statement was a lie, but it was an official lie backed by police reports, by photographs of the staged scene, by government authority. And in 1995, Mexico, official lies often became accepted truth because challenging them meant challenging the entire system of power that had governed the country for nearly 70 years. But this time, the lie couldn't hold. The 8 survivors told their story to journalists, to human rights organizations, to anyone who would listen. They described the checkpoint, the search, the execution. They named victims, provided details that matched forensic evidence. They were consistent, credible, impossible to dismiss as confused or lying. On June 29th, Mexican human rights organizations demanded an independent investigation. By June 30th, international organizations including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch had issued statements condemning the killings and calling for accountability. On July 1st, the Mexican press, even outlets typically friendly to the government, began publishing investigative pieces questioning the official narrative. The turning point came when a copy of the police video surfaced. Unbeknownst to most people involved, one of the police vehicles had a dashboard camera that had been recording during the massacre. The video wasn't supposed to exist. Commander Sanz had ordered all documentation destroyed, but one officer had kept a copy, possibly as insurance, possibly planning to sell it, possibly just following bureaucratic habit of keeping records. A journalist in Mexico City received the video anonymously in mid-July. He watched it, understood what he was seeing, and made copies before publishing it. The video was 11 minutes long, grainy with poor audio, but it showed clearly the 2 vehicles approaching the checkpoint, police forcing campesinos into a line, Lieutenant Solano giving orders. The shooting clearly showing campesinos with hands up, not resisting, not armed, Solano executing wounded survivors, police planting weapons near bodies afterward. The video was undeniable. It destroyed the government's narrative completely. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a massacre filmed by the perpetrators themselves. The video aired on national television on July 18, 1995. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted across Mexico. In Mexico City, over 100,000 people marched demanding justice for Aguas Blancas. International condemnation poured in. The United States State Department issued a statement expressing concern about human rights violations. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights announced they would investigate. Governor Figueroa initially tried to defend his police force, claiming the video was edited or taken out of context, but the pressure became unbearable. On August 12, 1995, Commander Sanz and Lieutenant Solano were arrested and charged with multiple counts of homicide. Eventually, 22 police officers would be charged with various crimes related to the massacre. The political consequences were swift. Governor Figueroa, under intense pressure from the federal government and facing potential criminal investigation himself, resigned on March 12, 1996, less than a year after the massacre. He would later face charges but would never be convicted. The Mexican legal system protecting powerful political figures even when their culpability was obvious. The legal proceedings against the police officers involved in the massacre dragged on for years, hampered by witness intimidation, judicial delays, and systematic obstruction. In December 1998, 3.5 years after the massacre, a court finally convicted 6 officers, including Lieutenant Solano. The sentences ranged from 8 to 25 years in prison, penalties that human rights organizations deemed far too lenient for what amounted to mass murder. Commander Sáenz Mata was acquitted in 2001, the court ruling there was insufficient evidence he directly ordered the executions, even though command responsibility doctrine suggested he bore responsibility for actions taken by officers under his command. He walked free, returned to civilian life, and lived quietly until his death in 2009. Of the 22 officers originally charged, only 8 were ultimately convicted. Most served between 6 and 12 years of their sentences before being released on various technicalities or through parole. By 2010, all had been released. None expressed remorse. None acknowledged wrongdoing. Several gave interviews claiming they'd been following orders, that they'd been scapegoated for political purposes, that the campesinos had been armed guerrillas, regardless of what the video showed. The families of the 17 dead campesinos faced not only grief, but also economic catastrophe. Most victims had been primary breadwinners for extended families. Their deaths left widows, children, elderly parents without support in communities where social safety nets didn't exist. Gilberto Romero Vázquez's wife, Maria Elena, was left with 5 children ranging from ages 7 to 19. The family had been poor before Gilberto's death. Afterward, they were destitute. Maria Elena tried to maintain the small plot of land they'd been farming, but without Gilberto's labor and organizing skills, she couldn't generate enough income. Within 2 years, she'd lost the land to creditors and had moved to Mexico City, where she worked as a domestic servant while her children struggled in urban schools, where they were mocked for their indigenous backgrounds and rural accents. In a 2005 interview, Maria Elena said, "Gilberto died for nothing. He believed organizing could change things, that demanding rights would lead to justice, but all it led to was his death and our suffering. The officers who killed him served a few years in prison and then were freed. We're still poor. Our community is still poor. Nothing changed except I lost my husband and my children lost their father." Severiano Santana Pineda's parents, both elderly, had been depending on Severiano for support. After his death, they had no income. Neighbors helped for a while, but rural poverty meant everyone was struggling. Severiano's father died in 1997, 2 years after the massacre, from what doctors called heart disease, but what his family knew was grief. His mother lived until 2003, never speaking about her son's death, keeping his notebooks and glasses in a box she refused to open. Elpidio Zamora Cruz, the 19-year-old, had been engaged to be married. His fiancée, Luz Maria, was 18 when he died. She never married, spent her life working in her family's small store, kept a photograph of Elpidio on her wall until her death in 2019. In an interview in 2015, she said simply, "He was my future. They killed my future." Fidel Valencia Pinacho, the 17-year-old who dreamed of teacher's college, left parents who'd invested everything in his education. His father, Vicente, had worked double shifts in coffee fields to pay for Fidel's school fees and books. After Fidel's death, Vicente stopped working, stopped caring about anything. He died in 2001, essentially from giving up. His widow said, "Vicente died the same day Fidel did. It just took 6 years for his body to realize it." The collective trauma extended beyond immediate families. The massacre devastated OCSS as an organization. Membership plummeted from over 2,000 before June 28th to fewer than 200 by the end of 1995. People were terrified. If organizing peacefully led to massacre, why organize at all? The message was clear: challenge the government and die. Stay quiet and maybe survive. Human rights organizations documented that at least 30 former OCSS members received death threats in the months following the massacre. Several were beaten by unknown assailants. 2 disappeared and were never found. The intimidation campaign was systematic, designed to ensure that no similar organization could emerge, that rural communities would return to their atomized powerlessness. The Aguas Blancas massacre became a defining moment in Mexican history, not because it was unique, but because it was documented. The video made undeniable what had always been true. The Mexican government routinely used violence against rural communities, particularly indigenous communities, and particularly against anyone who organized to demand their rights. Human rights organizations would later document that Aguas Blancas wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Between 1990 and 2000, at least 500 campesino activists were killed or disappeared in Mexico, victims of what scholars call Mexico's low-intensity war against its own rural population. Most of these cases received no media attention, no investigations, no justice. The perpetrators were never identified, or if identified, were never prosecuted. What made Aguas Blancas significant was that it couldn't be hidden. The video forced Mexico to confront something the country had always known but preferred to ignore: that the government maintained control in rural areas through violence, that indigenous lives were considered expendable, that the police and military operated with impunity in regions where poverty and geography made oversight impossible. The massacre accelerated changes already underway in Mexican politics. The PRI's dominance was eroding. Vicente Fox would be elected president in 2000, ending 71 consecutive years of PRI rule. The political opening created space for human rights organizations, for independent media, for civil society to demand accountability. But the structural problems remained: rural poverty, indigenous marginalization, police impunity, and the government's fundamental view that dissent was a threat requiring violent suppression rather than an opportunity for dialogue and reform. Guerrero State remained one of Mexico's most violent regions. The drug war that began in 2006 brought new violence, new disappearances, new mass graves. In 2014, 43 students from a teacher's college in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero, disappeared after being detained by local police and handed over to a drug cartel. The case generated international outrage, reminded people of Aguas Blancas, demonstrated that despite political changes, the same patterns of violence and impunity persisted. At Aguas Blancas itself, where 17 campesinos were massacred on a mountain road, there's now a memorial. It was erected in 2005, 10 years after the massacre, funded by donations from human rights organizations and surviving family members. The memorial consists of 17 crosses, each bearing a name, dates of birth and death, and the phrase, "Exigían justicia y encontraron la muerte." They demanded justice and found death. The location is remote, difficult to reach, visited mainly by family members on the anniversary of the massacre. On June 28th each year, a few dozen people gather, survivors, family members, activists, to remember what happened, to read the names of the dead, to demand accountability that will never come. The gathering is small, poorly attended, largely forgotten by a country that has moved on to new tragedies, new outrages, new reasons to grieve. One of the 8 survivors, a man named Ramiro Garcia Lopez, attends every year. In 2020, at age 63, he gave an interview to a journalist who asked if attending was too painful, if he should finally let go and move on. "Move on to what?" Ramiro replied. "I watched 17 friends die. I hid under a truck while police shot them like animals. I heard their screams. I heard them begging for their lives. I heard the final shots, the coup de grace the lieutenant gave to the wounded. How do you move on from that? Where do you go? That's far enough away to forget. I come here every year because someone has to remember. The government wants to forget. They want Aguas Blancas to disappear from history, to be just another incident in a country with so much violence that individual massacres blend together." But these weren't just statistics. These were men. Fathers, sons, brothers. They believed organizing could change things. They believed the Constitution's promises about rights and justice. They were wrong, and they died for being wrong. The least I can do is say their names, remember their faces, and tell anyone who will listen that this happened, that the government did this, and that justice was never served. The Aguas Blancas massacre forces uncomfortable questions about the nature of state violence, about the limits of peaceful protest, about what happens when governments view their own citizens as enemies to be eliminated rather than people to be served. The 17 campesinos who died weren't revolutionaries. They weren't armed guerrillas. They were farmers demanding fair prices for their crops, land titles for territory they'd worked for generations, basic infrastructure like schools and roads. They organized legally, protested peacefully, submitted petitions through proper channels. They did everything citizens are supposed to do in a democracy, and they were massacred for it. The Mexican government's response, initial denial, eventual grudging acknowledgement, minimal prosecutions, continued impunity, demonstrated that state violence against indigenous communities wasn't aberrational. It was policy. Not written policy, not official policy, but the operational reality of how the Mexican state maintained control over rural regions where indigenous populations demanded resources and rights that conflicted with government priorities and elite interests. The police officers who carried out the massacre weren't rogue actors. They were following a logic deeply embedded in Mexican governance. Rural communities, particularly indigenous communities, exist to provide cheap labor and to stay quiet. When they organize, when they demand more, they threaten a system built on their exploitation and marginalization, and threats must be eliminated. Was what happened at Aguas Blancas unique to Mexico, or does it reflect broader patterns of state violence against marginalized communities across Latin America, across the developing world, across any context where poverty and geography intersect with ethnic marginalization and political powerlessness? The uncomfortable answer is that Aguas Blancas was ordinary. 17 campesinos were massacred on a mountain road in Guerrero on June 28, 1995. But on that same day, across Mexico and across Latin America, countless other acts of state violence occurred, smaller, less dramatic, undocumented, but collectively representing a system of control that operates through fear, through violence, through the message that organizing for your rights will cost you everything, including your life. The tragedy of Aguas Blancas isn't just that 17 men died, it's that their deaths changed so little. OCSS dissolved. Rural organizing in Guerrero collapsed. The message was received: stay quiet or die, and most people chose to stay quiet because survival requires pragmatism, and challenging systems that can massacre you with impunity isn't pragmatic, it's suicidal. But some people didn't stay quiet. The families of the victims, the survivors, the human rights activists who documented what happened and fought for accountability, they refused to let Aguas Blancas be forgotten. They knew justice would never be served, that the police officers would serve minimal sentences, if any, that the government officials who created the conditions for massacre would never face consequences. But they kept talking, kept documenting, kept demanding that someone remember what happened on that mountain road. Because memory is sometimes the only justice available. When courts fail, when governments lie, when perpetrators walk free, memory becomes the final accountability. Saying the names, telling the story, refusing to let tragedy disappear into the silence that authorities prefer. Gilberto Romero Vázquez, Severiano Santana Pineda, Elpidio Zamora Cruz, Aurelio Torres Tapia, Fidel Valencia Pinacho, and 12 others whose names should be remembered but are too often forgotten. 17 campesinos who demanded their rights and found death. 17 lives ended by a state that viewed their demands as threats requiring elimination. Their memorial stands at Aguas Blancas, 17 crosses on a mountain road, visited by fewer people each year as memory fades and new tragedies demand attention. But the memorial is there. The names are there. And as long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells the story, the massacre can't be completely buried under the layers of official denial and willful forgetting that governments prefer. If this story made you think about state violence, about the price of demanding your rights in systems built on inequality, and about how communities survive when their own governments view them as enemies, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about justice, power, and the communities caught between them. Comment below. Where is the line between legitimate law enforcement and state terrorism? How should communities organize when peaceful protest can lead to massacre? Because these questions aren't just historical. They're being answered right now in rural communities across the world, where demanding dignity and rights still costs people everything, including their lives. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always rebels or criminals. Sometimes they're the ones wearing uniforms, carrying badges, claiming to act in the name of law and order, while executing citizens who dared to believe that organizing for justice was a right rather than a crime punishable by death.